he is deeply engaged in the fabric of our city's faith community and the life of the city, advocating for public education, public safety, and economic justice. They both have extensive bios, and we'll put links to those in the chat. I'm going to start first with Amy and say congratulations, first of all, on IFA's extraordinary victory in the Charlottesville lawsuit.
Thank you.
Now that the trial's over and you've had this victory, maybe we start by telling us a little bit about how you're thinking about that and your next steps.
Absolutely. So first of all, thank you, Jeremy, and the whole JCRC team. It is just wonderful to be with you again. And one day we will get to do one of these in person. But I'm thrilled that we get to be with you again and both update folks on this case and talk about the broader themes at hand, because I think what we saw 4.5 years ago in Charlottesville has really become a preview or a harbinger of what's followed in this country. Both the actual anti-Semitism, white supremacy, racism that was on display that weekend has really become increasingly normalized, as we're going to be talking about today. And it's fueled not just attacks like the Pittsburgh, Poway, El Paso, January 6th attacks, but we're seeing it really percolate and spread into a variety of other, perhaps smaller scale attacks on anything from, school boards to public health officials to pundits and political leaders who are espousing these sorts of conspiracies, this idea of Jews will not replace us or replacement theory. And so it's important to be clear-eyed about how what we saw 4 years ago really has continued to metastasize and grow and become increasingly normalized. And so I'm really grateful to have this conversation. And that makes it all the more important that we hold these extremists accountable however we can, which is what this case was about. We took to court on behalf of 9 Charlottesville community members who were injured, 24 neo-Nazis, white supremacists, and hate groups most directly responsible for orchestrating the violence. People like Richard Spencer, groups like National Socialist Movement, one of the country's largest neo-Nazi groups, Identity Europa, League of the South, and a number of other individuals and groups who, unsurprisingly, really comprise a who's who of the white supremacist movement. And after 4 long years of litigation, we went to trial in October, holding them accountable for their racist, anti-Semitic conspiracy to commit violence, to engage in violence in Charlottesville. And the jury thankfully agreed with the evidence that we laid out, sort of to the tune of over $26 million in judgments that they awarded to our plaintiffs, both compensatory and punitive damages against these defendants. And that's so important for so many reasons. It's important first and foremost because our plaintiffs, the community of Charlottesville, have seen such little justice in the aftermath of the violence. And that's not unique. We know that so many victims of extremism are seeing such little justice in this country, and seeking justice for them however we can is crucial. It's also important because we know civil litigation like this can have major financial and operational impacts on these defendants. People like Richard Spencer, who've already talked about how this case has financially devastated them. Groups like League of the South who've talked about how they can't open a new headquarters because of this case. And now as we move into the post-trial motions phase, which we're in right now, and ultimately collecting these judgments, we'll do what it's necessary to ensure that these defendants pay what they ultimately owe. And we know that that can have very real impacts on their ability to operate, and of course, in deterring others who are looking on. More broadly, though, we also know cases like this can really pull back the curtain on and expose how extremists operate. And that's all the more important at a time of increasing extremism. Seeing how their tools, the tactics that they use out there discussed in open court for the world to understand, for the media to understand, having experts like Pete Simi and Deborah Lipstadt talk about these tools and tactics and ideology, and really laying bare the hate and the violence that's at the core of this movement. When you have these defendants using the N-word in court, making Holocaust jokes on the stand, it makes crystal clear who they are and the violence and the hate that fuels their actions. And so laying bare all of that for the world to see is so important. And finally, we think it's important because we need a model for how we do this, for how we hold extremists accountable. And it's been heartening to see our case really become a model, with a number of January 6 lawsuits modeled on ours now moving forward in the courts against the Proud Boys, the Oath Keepers, President Trump, and others who were involved in planning, inciting, or engaging in the violence we saw a year ago there. And so there's so much that we hope that would come of this case. We're really gratified by the impact it's had. We're committed to seeing it through, no matter what the defendants try to do to escape liability, which has been quite common over the last 4 years, as you could imagine. I really think that the trial and the case itself is sadly a very important lens for exploring the broader rise of extremism in this country.
Thank you, Amy. Reverend Bodrick, let me invite you into this conversation with Amy. And let me start, for those in our audience who don't know, you've asked me to share a little about sort of how you come to this conversation. And I know in particular, the special history legacy of senior minister of 12th Baptist Church.
Yes, so first and foremost, thank you, Jeremy, and to the JCRC family, to Amy and IFA and the great work that you all are doing. And to each and every person who's viewing today, my name is Reverend Willie Bodrick II, and I serve as senior pastor of the historic 12th Baptist Church. You know, I come to this from a very historical framework, sitting in the position as I serve as the 14th senior pastor of this church that was known as the Fugitive Slave Church, which was a space of refuge for those who escaped from slavery here in this space. And we hold true to those values of upholding justice, mercy, and continuing to lead the legacy of justice. We find our heritage from 1805 in the African Meeting House down on Beacon Hill, and that history frames the way in which I think about not only what's happening right now, but the extremism that has always been present in American history. We must frame this properly by making sure that we understand that whenever there's been progress in American history, there's always been a backlash. Many a times that backlash has been met with white backlash that is addressing what was seemingly the status quo at that time. I think about the post-Reconstruction era, where D.W. Griffith's 1915 film, Birth of a Nation, stirs the reactivation of the Ku Klux Klan, which was stampered by government suppression. And after this film is put forth in the White House of all places under President Woodrow Wilson, we see the reactivation of this Klan and the extremism. And this is a response to what was seen as Black progress in the nation. And throughout what Rayford Logan coins as the nadir of the American Black life in this country, we've seen extremist groups by name or by unnamed gatherings unleash violence upon Black bodies in this country, Black institutions, Black communities, which normalize in this country not only white supremacy that permeated all aspects of American life, that affected all persons that were considered other, but it also made us comfortable with Black death. And I say this to frame our discussion because this is no shock to many in our community of this resurgence. Many said it never really went away. This extremism has come again, I would argue, to the response of progress that has been happening in this country. And many of times, the ways in which this extremism is developed is to appeal to white fear and white anxieties that are usually unfounded when in regards to facts. And so, and I think of the Obama administration. President Barack Obama becomes the first Black president in this nation. And during that tenure, we're seeing some of those progressive policies push forward. And you see the rise of hate groups again, the activity. And then post the Obama administration, we come into a Trump administration where many would argue, and myself included, that there was this dog whistling towards white supremacist groups, sometimes more overt than we've ever heard from the White House. I remember the dog whistle to the Proud Boys and appealing to these racist ideals and these fears. And it's from those moments where we see not only groups all across this country pop up, we see violence all of a sudden pop up all across this country. We're seeing it actually permeated upon a continuum. I would argue that this continuum is not only just the extreme violence, but also in our everyday life. In the pundits' commentary, as Amy suggested, in the ways in which our curriculums and our school systems are now being addressed, in the ways in which laws are being codified in legislatures all across this country. And so that's how you get to a Charlottesville. That's how you get to a January 6th, where there's an extremist attempt to overthrow the democracy of our country. That's how you get to the murder of Ahmaud Arbery. where we just saw, those who took his life be held to account. And that's how you get to, even currently, just last month, Black churches and HBCUs were threatened with bomb threats during Black History Month. This has not gone away. It's almost as American as apple pie. And we must actually recognize that this backlash is not just happening in the South. It's not just happening in the Midwest. It's right here in Massachusetts. And that must be stated. On January 22nd, there were 24 white nationalists who were protesting outside of Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston with a bed sheet saying that B&W Hospital kills whites. All of this because there were 2 doctors who were working to establish equity in healthcare for communities of color. I think back last year, Jeremy, in Winthrop, Massachusetts, 2021, there were 2 Black people, a retired Massachusetts State Police trooper and a retired Air Force veteran, David Green and Ramona Cooper. They were killed by a white shooter who had been found to have anti-Black racist writings, anti-sexist writings, and have drawings of white superiority and swastikas drawn everywhere. You had a rabbi who was stabbed in Brighton. I used to live in Brighton, stabbed in Brighton repeatedly. And we stood up and talked about the rise of these hate crimes. And then in 2020, at the end of the year in Springfield, Massachusetts, you had the Martin Luther King Jr. Presbyterian Church, Community Presbyterian Church, was burned to the ground, leaving nothing but a few pews standing and set on fire. And the perpetrator of that crime was found with white supremacist paraphernalia. We have to acknowledge that this is not just something that's happening away, it's happening in our backyards. And that we need to do the work, not only through litigation, but also through conversation and through learning to address it.
Thank you both for taking us straight into the heart of the conversation right away. For our audience, just those who are new to us, if you want to ask a question, please throw it in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. We'll try to get as many of the issues that are raised in the Q&A into the conversation in our time together. So you've given us a lot of directions to go in already. And certainly, Reverend Bodrick, you talk about dog whistles, and I don't think there's a person, at least in the Jewish community, I'll say, who will forget the whole experience of seeing people marching in Charlottesville saying Jews will not replace us. And then only a few days later, hearing the President of the United States say that there were very fine people on both sides. Those are 2 images and quotes that are seared into our collective experience. And I'd like to get into a bit of so many of the particular and local events. And I appreciate, Reverend Bodrick, you bring it really into the context of New England as well. But I want to pull back out just a little bit farther and also invite the larger media environment, the larger contextual environment, the political environment in which this is happening, for both of you to respond to. And I'm sure Amy has a lot of thoughts about this.
I'm sure we all do. Look, I think that's absolutely right. And I totally agree with everything the Reverend said in terms of the ways this is playing out, not just locally, but for communities around this country. And I think the examples that he rattled off there are just a microcosm of how this sort of extremism is manifesting. And it can happen anywhere. I think many people think of the Boston area as a progressive place. I went to school there. I spend a lot of time in the area. I live in New York, where we similarly are considered a progressive mecca, but this sort of stuff is happening here too. And we need to be very clear about the fact that this extremism is not sparing any community around this country, in terms of geography and in terms of so many communities that are being caught up here. And that's because of the fact that we're seeing it become acceptable. We're seeing it become normalized before our eyes. And this is happening in a variety of ways. I think even if you just pull on the thread of replacement theory, you mentioned Jews will not replace us. What does that actually mean? I think many of us remember the images of Nazis with torches chanting that, but that specifically speaks to the white supremacist conspiracy of the Great Replacement, this idea that Jews are the puppet masters, orchestrating the advancement of Black people, brown people, immigrants, refugees, anyone who doesn't fit into the vile, narrow definition of what this country should be. That's why we had our first Black president. It's why the Black Lives Matter protests last 2 years ago were so successful. It's why, any of these things that these extremists believe are detrimental to the white ethno-state they seek are happening. There has to be some sort of puppet master. And like with many conspiracy theories, it's the Jews, and it involves the Black community and many others. And so if you look at how that conspiracy has really evolved over the last few years, it's a perfect example of how this extremism has become increasingly normalized. First, you see people like Tucker Carlson on Fox News, elected officials like Paul Gosar, Marjorie Taylor Greene, and a number of others alluding to this. But over the course of the last few years, getting increasingly comfortable saying it quite explicitly. And I would argue that many of these people, when they're talking about a globalist plot to, undermine the election through bringing in immigrants and refugees and others, that is a direct reference to the same sort of conspiracy theory. When you hear claims of George Soros supporting Black Lives Matter protests or supporting caravans of people coming up through the southern border, that is also a direct reference to this sort of replacement theory. And again, you're hearing it not just from neo-Nazis who are attacking communities like Charlottesville or shooting up synagogues in Pittsburgh or Poway or Walmarts in El Paso or whatever it might be. You're seeing it from people who are considered part of our actual political and media institutions, members of Congress, primetime TV hosts. And the longer we allow this to go on unchecked, the longer we allow these elected officials to remain in Congress without facing any sort of censure, which is exactly what's been happening. Certainly these same elected officials just 2 weekends ago were keynote speakers at a white nationalist conference, where they not only took the stage with avowed neo-Nazis, but were there celebrating that community while they chanted in support of Putin. And so understanding the ways in which we are seeing not just the obvious players, but the people who are considered part of the sort of institutions of our society espousing the same extremism is so important to understanding how we got here. And as the Reverend has said, this is not new. We've seen this play out in various ways for centuries. But the way in which it's happening right now, particularly with the use of social media that amplifies it through disinformation, through algorithms that oftentimes promote people going down the rabbit hole of extremism, and because of the sort of grievance politics we're seeing increasingly common on the right, using events like COVID, using claims of critical race theory to further this sort of white supremacy, it's all the more dangerous in this moment. And I think we need to be very clear about how it's happening and where it's happening, especially. And it can't be political to say as much. It can't be political to say, here are elected officials, here are GOP officials, here's Fox pundits who are normalizing the sort of white supremacy.
I am going to come back to that in a moment, but first I want to give Reverend Bodrick an opportunity to respond and engage in this conversation.
Yeah, I think Amy points to something very clear that, this is manifested itself in various aspects of our society. I would even go a further step to even suggest that even in our school systems, when we're having these kind of conversations around critical race theory, which is a legal theory that has nothing to do with what's happening in our school systems. When we're getting to this place where we're starting to ban books again, like The Bluest Eye or Sula, or any of the works of Toni Morrison, we're flirting into territory that is not only reminiscent of a different time, but I think as you already articulated, it's become even more dangerous in a moment where you have these functions such as social media to actually drive these messages to your home, inside your space, inside your most intimate spaces, to radicalize people. And I think this is something that we have to really think about as we're talking about this, is the radicalization and how fast it happens in our moment, in our day and time. And we have to hold people accountable. We have to hold the press accountable in ways, I think about the ways in which Tucker Carlson has been speaking about Ketanji Brown Jackson. These subtle stereotypes that are dog whistles to Black inferiority or the inferiority of others only perpetuates an idea in the American conscience that makes way for such extremism to have validations to their unfounded claims. It makes ways for them to feel comfortable to perpetuate violence in order to achieve their goals. And I think the narratives that they are buying into are definitely dangerous if they're not called out. And I think it's so important that we are very careful to learn from our past, because if our institutional life begins to give way to this way of thinking and to these ideas, to these practices, it is very, very, very possible for us to slip back into another space where more lives will be taken. This is something, that I always look at through the lens of African-American history, because it wasn't just the fact that these groups existed. It was the blind eye that the state took towards not addressing them. And I think right now we are in a very vulnerable moment where there's so many people who are at stake of being hurt or harmed because our institutions are now again becoming comfortable with rhetoric and with actions that could lead to the lives of people who are working and serving and trying to just do their everyday work for their families and their communities. And we saw that, Charlottesville, someone lost their life. And we must acknowledge that. And January 6th, someone else could have lost their lives if it wasn't for the brave, persons that were there serving to make sure that those people were safe and for protective measures. But, there was life lost that was unnecessary. And we must root out these narratives that continue to be perpetuated through our media as well as through our politics.
So I want to follow up, Amy, you said something, and I think what I want to sort of raise here, but because we've talked about this before, and you named people, and I feel like almost a little bit embarrassed or unfortunate almost in some ways that I have to say this, but like, we are a nonpartisan organization. We don't take sides in the electoral process as JCRC, and there's a bit of a dilemma here. Does it feel a little bit like you were raising something, you were talking about people in public office, you were talking about a political process, and I'm sort of opening up the framework here of like, let's be explicit about the fact that for much of us in the organized Jewish community, I think in a lot of communities, there is this deliberate, intentional desire to stay out of partisan politics, and yet this is in some ways something that it's impossible to talk about without talking about partisan politics, and you named it. And I just really want to reflect on that and go there with you and talk about this as a challenge, because it's a challenge in our democratic system.
Yeah. And I think that this cuts in so many different directions. And I'm sure that in the coming months and years, there's going to be really fascinating research on this as we dig more into it. But I think I want to be very clear. This is not a partisan issue. This can't be a partisan issue, and this shouldn't be considered political. It is a fundamental issue of human rights, of civil rights, and of, I think, decency to call out those who are elevating and promoting extremism that has led directly to the deaths of so many people around this country, of so many different communities. And we can't be naive about this. It is the extremists who use this sort of guise, this excuse of politics to try to give cover to their extremism. We saw that in our trial, where the defendants tried to say that this was a political trial, that they were being put on trial for their ideology because we disagreed with their politics. And what gave me hope was that after 4 weeks of listening to the evidence, of hearing the violence, the hate, the extremism that's at the core of how these defendants operated, the jury, which came from a very politically diverse section of Virginia, not just Charlottesville, but the surrounding areas, which are quite different than Charlottesville politically, as you could imagine. The jury listened to that and said, no, this is not acceptable. This has no place in our country, and there should be consequences. What's dangerous is that there are efforts by many, including in the media, to sort of muddy the waters there and create false equivalencies. And I think in many ways, some of the ideas we've talked about, the critical race theory debate, the COVID anti-maskers, all of these things have been effectively Trojan horses that extremists have latched onto to bring their increasingly violent views into the mainstream, sort of under the cover of this broader culture war that we're supposedly happening in this country. And I think it's incumbent on the media, it's incumbent on our political leaders to understand that difference, that that at the end of the day, there is no place in our society, in our democracy, for those who believe violence is the answer to their grievances. And that shouldn't be something we need to say, but I think in 2022, it sadly is. And when you see political leaders latch onto these extremists, giving megaphones and platforms on prime time to their views, and refusing to really condemn it in any real way, even if they pretend, even if you have statements from the chair of the GOP talking about how there's no place in the GOP for white supremacists. Well, if you're going to allow your members to attend white supremacist conferences and ensure that they don't face any real consequences, you're saying, well, it's okay. And so we need to say that this has no place here, and actually then take the action to illustrate that. And I think that right now, for me, that is what is most frightening in our politics. As I said, I don't want to leave people totally depressed. I think there are reasons for hope. I think our trial illustrated that again, when you really dig into what is at stake here, what these people are actually promoting, the average American recognizes that. But they just need to be told that this is what this is. When we talk about critical race theory, we want to talk about so many of these other Trojan horses that we've been talking about. It's not those things, it's white supremacy. And I think we need to figure out a way to tell that story more effectively.
Reverend Bodrick?
No, I think it's a very interesting point. I think to add to what would seemingly be a framework for the perpetuation of this type of belief and ideology, you have to discuss faith. Faith traditions have made way for a lot of this to be perpetuated. And I'm one who's always holding communities of faith accountable to actually acknowledge when we are seeing hatred being perpetuated through ill-advised exegesis or just through outright bastardization of practices of the tradition in order to promote a certain ideology. And undergirding a lot of this has been faith traditions across the board who have allowed for these opportunities, these organizations, these groups to continue to manifest right up under their nose. And I think those conversations need to be had as well in the most intimate spaces. Like, what are we to do? Where's their hope? There's hope to be in our most intimate spaces and to actually have these tough conversations, to actually speak towards what we see, what is happening, and really inform those who are there with us, and to make sure that we're having these conversations responsibly. There are those who believe that we are in a culture war, and we must acknowledge that. And so in order to address those realities, we need to be equipped with the information to do the unlearning. I think the unlearning that is necessary for so many who are susceptible of some of these ideas and some of these different beliefs that are being thrown at them from every which way, through every different medium, and making sure that we're giving them sound information and giving them sources that they can actually look to that are founded in some actual fact and truth. And so I think that is important as we're having these conversations, as we're doing this work. But as we're doing it, we must also ourselves continue to be encouraged by the work and binding ourselves together across community lines like we're doing today. Because I think if you're working in isolation, it's easy to feel as if this work cannot be done.
So, Pastor Bodrick, I want to sort of really follow up on that and go there a little bit and talk about sort of the Black community and the Jewish community together in this. And Amy, described in a particular example in the work that she's been doing about the Great Replacement theory and sort of this conspiracy effort by the far right to connect various communities in one conspiracy theory. Mm-hmm. You earlier referenced the attacks, the threats against historically Black colleges and universities earlier this year. And as you talked about that, I was mindful at the time, and I think about it since, we talk a lot about Jewish security and Jewish institutional security. We do a lot of advocacy around sort of public funding for nonprofit security. Mm-hmm. I will freely own, I don't think we in the Jewish community do a lot of yelling and screaming from the rooftops when the threats came along towards, historically Black colleges and universities. Mm-hmm. And I would flip that around and say, I'm not sure we've actually really built that strong a partnership as communities working in terms of public and federal funding for nonprofit security. So there is a sense of connection, and also maybe a sense that we're going in our own sort of like conversations here. And then I'll add to that, because you referenced well, Fox News has been referenced a few times, and the attacks on Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson have been referenced as well. We saw this just yesterday where Fox put up a piece that basically tried to malign the judge and imply that she was an anti-Semite based on an event that was hosted at Harvard University when she was an undergraduate there, which there is no evidence that she attended the event even. And some of us called it out yesterday. It wasn't just us at JCRC. I weighed in. I had a particular sort of connection to the context. I saw some other Jewish organizations call it out. But we see active efforts to actually put wedges in between our communities in that moment. We literally saw it yesterday. People who are trying to prevent her confirmation, and this is not an endorsement or a non-endorsement of her, we don't weigh in on the Supreme Court, who are trying to drive a wedge between the Black community and the Jewish community around issues of anti-Semitism. And at the same time, we see ourselves going in different paths on, say, what we talked about earlier. I'm curious if you have any reflections on where we're doing well together, where we are succeeding, what we can do better as communities standing together in the face of this challenge.
Yes, this is a very complicated question, Jeremy, but I appreciate you bringing it forward. I'll start with the wedge. There's a lot of money that goes into divisive politics. And when I say a lot of money, I'm not just talking about a couple hundreds of thousands. I'm talking about millions of dollars that study the ways in which to turn one community against another, to actually to push for narratives that will create those divisions. Because I think people do understand that when people are actually coalescing around an idea together, there's power in people. I just really do believe that there's power in collective efforts, there's power in people of like mind working towards creating a better society and community. And so I don't think it was beneath Fox to do something of such. This is actually a part of their playbook, so to speak, to utilize these moments, because we know that one tweet about someone being racist, and one tweet or one soundbite about someone being anti-Semitic is enough to turn millions of people in the blink of an eye against, either to turn them off from the issue or to either turn them against someone. And so it's important that what you did yesterday is say, you know what, that's not true. That's unfounded. And people who are actually being attentive to actually push back. This happens all the time on Twitter, which is a crazy place if you're ever on there, where, there's this retracting all the time, or someone doing this fact checking, because sometimes people just run with it. And once it gets going, it's hard to pull back. And so I think, big media knows that. They understand that, especially, Fox, who's, in the midst of this war, pushing out narratives. They know that. And so I think, it's incumbent on us to not be comfortable with what's just dictated out to us. And so I think that's the first piece about the wedge. The other piece is about relationships. Like, the best way to actually address wedges is to have relationships. The fact that we could have this conversation together and begin this conversation is a big part of why I think the wedges don't always work. And I believe that where we're not doing well, Jeremy, between Black and Jewish communities, are relationships. And I'll be very honest about that. It's easy when we see the big banner white supremacy attack both individual, groups, and we're all like, you know what, that was anti-Semitic, that was racist. But beyond that, many a times we don't have those conversations. We don't have the difficult conversations around the intracommunal stereotypical ideologies that we have about one another. And how do we come to actually unlearning and engaging in compassion and love and understanding? And so I think it starts. And, I remember when I was in college, we do these things called Hallelujah Shabbats, and we would have these conversations across communal lines. That's just one small example of the start of those conversations. But I do think it takes hard work to come into conversations with histories of people who have been traumatized, who've been hurt, who have been brutalized, who've been killed, who've been murdered, and are still standing. I think both communities have a spirit of resilience and speak towards that with truth and with power. And so one of the things I always say is that there's no competition in the pains in which we've experienced. I can acknowledge the history of Jewish people in this world and acknowledge that there's been great harm done against Jewish people in this world. And I think many of my Jewish brothers and sisters can acknowledge that the same has happened to Black bodies in this world as well. And so I don't see this as a competition. I see this as us driving towards our communities, bettering ourselves as a community, and working together. In the American context, it is better that we're working together than anything, to give affirmation to the humanity, not of just our own communities, but of all people. And so, I can go on all day about what we're not doing well, but I do think these conversations begin the start of something that could be better. And I think Boston is a great place to do that, because, this is a place where supposedly we have all the intellectual capital. We have a lot of capital around us. We're committed to being that beacon on a hill that should not be hid. And so we should be able to hopefully bring ourselves into safe space to have tough conversations and prayerfully walk away better than when we came. And so I think that is the start of this, to really address that, and to be able to be equipped to acknowledge those moments when wedges are being used to work against us and not together for us.
Preach. Amy, you want to add anything here?
No, I totally agree. And I think it's a very deliberate tactic, not just in our politics, but in how these extremists operate to try to tear communities apart. That's what this is. That's why you see white supremacists and other extremist groups running disinformation campaigns on social media, pretending to be Jewish people, making racist comments, or vice versa. And it's a very specific strategy that they use, because at the end of the day, we all know, as we're talking about, that all of our fates are intertwined, that we can't take on anti-Semitism without taking on the white supremacy, the racism, the xenophobia that's at the core of what animates it. And you can't take on racism and white supremacy and xenophobia and other forms of hate without taking on the anti-Semitism that motivates so many of the conspiracies and other attacks on those communities. And so we recognize that, but I think that efforts to try to tear communities apart are so easy these days with disinformation, with social media, that we need to be particularly attuned to it. And I also think that particularly in the Jewish community, we have to both recognize the ways in which our fates are intertwined, and also recognize that, for example, I'm a Jewish woman, but I'm white presenting. And so the ways in which I experience hate are different than the ways in which Reverend Bodrick might, or someone else in the Black community, the Latino community, or any others. And recognizing how oppression works, how hate works in this country, the ways in which it manifests are different for each community, while still acknowledging that our fates are deeply intertwined in this fight, is so important. And I think that's hard in some communities, because we're sort of put into this corner where we sort of have the oppression Olympics, and we want to say, well, our plight is more difficult than this community's. And it's not a competition, as the Reverend said. In fact, it can't be, because again, all of our fates are intertwined. And if we allow these extremists to tear our communities apart, they're going to succeed, not just in tearing us apart, but in promoting the far extremist beliefs and actions that they want to see manifest in our society.
Amy, this has been in some ways an inevitably dark conversation, and in some ways maybe a hopeful conversation that we can have this and have some of these examples. For the sake of our audience, I want to sort of spend a few minutes here on what does it mean to hold people accountable, and in particular for, not all of us can start an organization, bring a lawsuit, and spend 4 years preparing for and being at trial. For the rest of us, what are the actions that are involved in holding people accountable? And maybe even what are the organizations or groups that we should be looking to in that work? And actually, for that last part, also for Pastor Bodrick, locally, I would add that as well. So Amy, why don't we start with you about being practical about what does it mean to hold people accountable and the actions?
And I think you're right. This has been a fairly dark conversation, perhaps. And I do think, as I alluded to earlier, there are reasons for hope. I'm the granddaughter of Holocaust survivors. It's very easy to feel like we're living in a moment where there are parallels to that dark time in our history. And certainly there are parallels. We would be ignorant and naive if we tried to ignore what's happening in our society. That's what this whole event is about, calling it out. But I think we also need to recognize the difference, that unlike my grandparents' generation, unlike many other generations before us, there are tools that we can use, and we have to fight like crazy to protect those tools, to improve those tools, to ensure that they work equitably for everyone, because they certainly don't. But using tools like our justice system and our voices, our advocacy, to make sure that we are not just calling out these extremists, but holding them accountable however possible is key. And so certainly, we were glad to do so through the justice system, and we're seeing this case really become a model, and that's important. But I think in many ways, the local action is that much more crucial, because that's where you can really make the biggest difference. And that's important on so many fronts. Understanding how this is becoming normalized. When you see if you're at your school board meeting and you see sort of these insane attacks related to critical race theory, if you're involved with local government or otherwise, and see how some of these anti-COVID public health measure attacks can morph into racist, anti-Semitic conspiracies, calling it out, making clear that that sort of bigotry and hate has no place in our politics, advocating to your local elected officials to do something about it. That is so crucial. And I think it's also important that we not become desensitized to it. Because of how normal some are trying to make this in our society, it's inevitable that the more we hear it, the easier it will be to accept it. And that, in fact, it was one of the very deliberate strategies of the defendants at our trial. One of the defense attorneys said afterwards that they made Holocaust jokes and used the N-word and did all these awful things over and over again in an attempt to desensitize the jury to hate. And the jury didn't buy it, of course. And we can't let that happen to us either. We need to keep recognizing, whether it be on Fox News, whether it be from elected officials, whether it be on local levels in our communities around this country, that this is happening and we need to call it out. And there's so many ways to do that. I think, of course, we at IFA are continuing to fight extremism. There are many national organizations doing important work in this space on so many different levels. From the Leadership Conference for Civil Rights, Maya Wiley was just appointed as the new president. She's fantastic, a former colleague of mine, and the Lawyers Committee, the ADL, the SPLC, you could go on and on.
Which is Southern Poverty Law Center.
Yes. And of course, groups like the JCRC and others, which exist in communities around the country to provide sort of a central means of advocacy and coming together. And I think all of those organizations are so crucial. But I would say particularly getting involved on the local level is one of the most important things you can do, because we're increasingly seeing this extremism play out there. And so while we shouldn't sort of seed the field when it comes to the national issues, I think where the average person can make the biggest impact and where we can begin to turn the tides is actually on the local level, not just in pushing back, but in developing the resiliency, the sort of whole of society approach we need to understand extremism and prevent it from spreading.
Thank you. So Pastor Bodrick, specifically on the local level.
Yeah.
And name names, organizations we should all be working with and partnering with.
I think about the NAACP of Boston, who's always been on the front lines of addressing these issues and making sure that there's a voice brought to it. I think about Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights here now LCR and the work that they've been doing to address these matters. I think about the Urban League of Massachusetts, who's always taken a strong stance and making sure that they speak up when it comes to these particular matters. JCRC has already been mentioned, and others groups who have been working to make sure that these things are being done. There are always these pockets of people who are working in community that don't get credit, that don't have names, but they're fighting on the side of justice. I think about BJA, I think about Boston Network for Black Student Achievement. I think about all these groups that are working to say, look, we're going to push back against any form of this manifesting in ways that would have detrimental impacts on our communities. But what I think is also important is making sure that we hold our local officials accountable. That when they see these things, they should say something. It's literally, they should not be able to just fall back and say that this is not an issue I want to touch. When they see something, we need them to speak up. That is the platform that they have. And I'm not just talking about elected officials, I'm talking about local officials as well, right? Your local rabbi, your pastor, whoever it may be, your principal of your school, the superintendent, wherever that position may be, where there is power for the control of community to make sure that communities are safe and they need to be able to be empowered to speak up, and they need to know that there are people who are supporting them when they speak up. One of the things I was very happy about when we saw some of the threats be levied against, now U.S. Attorney Rachel Rollins, is that there was a response of faith leaders that came collectively. I think it's important that whenever things like this happen, we should be collectively coming together to say, we are against this. That I think that's the lowest threshold we can have, is to make a collective statement to say we are against this. This should not happen in our community. And I think it's a model for people all across the country. And then we need to push our legislatures to say, look, there needs to be accountability, literally from a legal perspective. There needs to be accountability for people who participate in these particular actions. There are federal laws on the books already, but there needs to be accountability against any of these actions happening in our cities and our communities. And when these things happen, we are not going to give them breath to endorse it or to promote it. That's something that I think is so important as we move forward in this work. And I think if we do that prayerfully, we'll get to where we need to be. But we need to make sure to say that this is not normal. This should not be.
Thank you. There are an extraordinary number of questions, way more than we typically have, which probably is a reflection of the deep interest of our audience in being a part of this work. So I guess I'm going to turn it over to you, Pastor Bodrick, and then Amy, I'm going to come to you the final question because we're coming up on the end of our hour. I'm going to ask Amy sort of like about what's next for IFA to bring us home. But before I do that, Pastor Bodrick, what do you say to local activists who just want to do one last thing? And what are you looking to do next here in Boston with us, with others in this work?
Oh, well, there's so much we need to do in Boston. In regards to this work, I think there's some interesting things happening in this city around reparations and the repair. I think that there's something important happening in this moment where we are thinking about how do we bring healing, truth, reconciliation in this moment. And I think that's something that we all should be working on. I want to shout out King Boston and Amari Parrish Jeffries, who's been taking the lead on a lot of this work. But I think about my law professor, Margaret Burnham, we worked on this at Northeastern University School of Law, really digging into reparations and thinking critically about this and putting forward work about this. There are things that we can be doing in the city of Boston that can bring healing and repair. It manifests in so many ways when it comes to housing, when it comes to health equity, when it comes to education equity and access and opportunity. There's so many things that I think we need to be worried about as a community and as a city writ large. And I'm hoping that we can begin to do that. I also think a part of that truth and reconciliation is actually talking about history, like really correcting the record, lifting up the narratives of those stories in this city that have been erased. Now, Boston is seen as progressive in some communities across the country, but in my community, it's not seen as progressive. It's seen as a place that you don't want to come to. And so I think lifting up and restoring the narratives and redeeming those lives who have given so much to this city and broadening the understanding of how we think critically about those who have given their lives in this and help to develop this city. I think that's important work that needs to be done. And I think as we do that work, not only do we learn from one another, but we work towards building a better future.
Thank you. Amy, you're going to get the final word here. And, we started, I guess, this conversation with you almost 2 years ago. You were generating support and trying to build a team to bring this lawsuit in which you were successful. We've talked about that a little bit. I guess, we want to end this with sort of what is next for Integrity for America? Where is your work going? Where is Amy Spitalnick's work going after this lawsuit is behind you?
It's a big question. Look, I think we're both, the lawsuit and the conversation that we're having here really intersect in so many perfect ways, because I think the lawsuit illustrates that we're not powerless. There are things we can do and gives reason for hope. But I think, again, as we've been talking about, we need to be clear-eyed about how this extremism has morphed and grown over the last 4.5 years ago since Unite the Right, the ways in which it's become normalized and mainstreamed, how the movement has changed, the ways in which efforts like our lawsuit have marginalized a lot of the leaders, but at the same time, understanding how this extremism continues to manifest in new and equally dangerous ways is crucial. And so for us, we're doing both a few things logistically to make sure that the impact of the lawsuit is felt, and then thinking about things on the broader front to make sure that the work we're doing continues to meet the moment that we're in. So practically, any lawyers on the call know that there's inevitably a slew of post-trial motions that go into the court after verdicts like this. In fact, our post-trial motions are due tomorrow, March 9th, and we'll be putting in a number to ensure that the defendants who were found to be in default before trial also have to pay up in terms of what they will owe the plaintiffs, and also seeking attorney's fees. And we will, of course, be fighting efforts by the defendants to do whatever they can to try to reduce the damages that they owe, and we're committed to doing that. And, IFA is committed to continuing to support the legal team in doing that over the coming months. And then we will move into judgment collection, following these defendants around, in some cases for the rest of their lives, to putting liens on their homes, garnishing wages, seizing assets, doing what it takes to make sure that they pay up however they can. And certainly given the nature of the judgments in this case, it's going to be a significant undertaking. So working with our legal team and our plaintiffs to make sure the systems are in place for that. But also, as I mentioned, we've been heartened to see our case really become a model for how you do this, with the DC Attorney General and other officials and leaders bringing lawsuits modeled on ours against the January 6th insurrectionists. And so supporting their efforts, working with them to make sure that the precedent created by this case, that the resources created by this case live on. The transcripts from the trial are on our website. We're launching soon a searchable database of all trial evidence, which we hope is a resource not just to researchers and others fighting hate in their communities, but also to those who are pursuing legal action as well. And then for us, we're figuring out, do we continue to team up with others in this space? Perhaps there's additional litigation to be brought. I suspect there'll be no shortage of needs in this space. And just making sure that, again, the lessons from this trial, from Unite the Right, live on, because really our case is the only place where the full story of Unite the Right is told: the complaint, the trial, and as we've been discussing for the last hour, what happened 4 years ago really was that preview, that harbinger of what's followed. And understanding that, making sure those lessons live on, is something that I'm personally deeply committed to doing, however necessary, and I know our whole team is as well. And so I suspect that there'll be no shortage of need in this space, and we're certainly committed to trying to meet that moment and working with partners around the country to do so.
Well, that's a great note to end on. I think you've clearly both demonstrated there's a need, there's work to be done. This is long haul work. We're very fortunate here at JCRC to have partners like both of you and your institutions in this work, and very grateful for you to begin to share some of the roadmap ahead, how the work might be done, and where all of us who are here today can be a part of that work. So really just thank you both for everything that you do and for your friendship and your partnership, and thank you to everybody for joining us today. We will be sending out a follow-up email with more information about Integrity First for America to get involved in the work, as well as some information about Pastor Bodrick and his work. We did throw a link in the chat to Came Boston, and we'll have additional information about other ways to be involved locally here in Boston. For those of you here in Boston, we invite you to join us this Thursday, March 10th, 7 p.m. for JCRC's virtual legislative reception, where we'll be honoring outstanding public officials who've demonstrated their commitment to our community's priorities. We'll particularly be highlighting JCRC's work with Jewish Family Service of Metro West on our Afghan resettlement efforts, our work to secure funding for social service agencies, and, as mentioned earlier, for nonprofit security. And we'll be showing our appreciation to Governor Charlie Baker for his partnership throughout the years. Registration for our legislative reception will be included in the chat and in the follow-up email. Again, my thanks to our partners, Amy Spitalnick and Pastor Willie Bodrick. Thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you.